The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty path as Harold Thompson made his way back from the local market in Amboseli, Kenya. At 68, his weathered hands carried the weight of loss more than the simple groceries he'd purchased. 6 months had passed since Margaret's funeral, and the silence in their small cottage near the conservation boundary had become unbearable. Each step along the familiar route reminded Harold of walks he'd shared with his wife of 42 years. Margaret had possessed an infectious enthusiasm for the African landscape that surrounded their modest home. She would point out changes in the acacia trees, celebrate the return of migrating birds, and maintain detailed journals about the wildlife patterns they observed together. Now, Berwart, the same sights that once filled Harold with wonder served only as painful reminders of what he'd lost. Harold had come to Kenya 15 years ago when he retired from his engineering career in Manchester. The decision hadn't been easy, leaving behind friends, familiar surroundings, and the comfortable predictability of English life. But Margaret had dreamed of seeing elephants in their natural habitat since childhood, when her grandmother had shown her faded photographs from a colonial-era expedition. Together, they'd spent months researching locations, eventually settling on a small property on the edge of the Amboseli ecosystem, where they could observe wildlife while respecting conservation boundaries. Those early years had been magical. Harold used his engineering skills to design rainwater collection systems and solar power installations that allowed them to live comfortably while minimizing their environmental impact. Margaret threw herself into learning Swahili, volunteering with local women's cooperatives, and documenting the behavior of elephants that passed through their area. They'd hosted visiting researchers, contributed data to conservation organizations, and built friendships within the local community that enriched their retirement beyond anything they'd imagined. But cancer had ended those dreams with brutal efficiency. Margaret's diagnosis came suddenly, during what should have been a routine checkup during one of their annual trips back to England. The aggressive form of ovarian cancer gave them only 8 months together after the initial discovery. Months spent mostly in London hospitals rather than the African paradise they'd created together. Now, surrounded by the vast landscape that once filled them both with wonder, Harold felt more isolated than ever. The house seemed too quiet without Margaret's laughter, too empty without her constant stream of observations about their surroundings. Even simple tasks like grocery shopping had become exercises in endurance, reminders of how thoroughly his life had been intertwined with hers. It was on this particular morning, as he rounded the bend toward home with a bag of vegetables and tinned goods, that Harold first noticed her. A lone elephant, clearly separated from any herd, stood near the acacia grove about 50 meters from his property line. Something about her posture struck him as profoundly wrong. The way she favored her left rear leg, the listless manner in which she picked at the thorny vegetation, the absence of the purposeful movement that characterized healthy elephants. Harold stopped walking and studied the animal more carefully. During his 15 years in Kenya, he'd observed hundreds of elephants, learning to read their body language and recognize signs of distress. This female, probably in her 20s based on her size and the development of her tusks, bore unmistakable evidence of injury. Her left hindquarters showed scarring and deformation that suggested an old wound, likely from a poacher's snare that had since been removed but left permanent damage. What struck Harold most powerfully was the elephant's isolation. Elephants were intensely social creatures, living in complex matriarchal groups that provided support, protection, and companionship throughout their lives. For a female to be alone suggested either temporary separation from her family, or, more troubling, rejection due to her disability. Harold had read enough about elephant behavior to know that severely injured animals sometimes couldn't keep up with the herd's movements and were eventually left behind, a harsh but necessary adaptation for group survival. For 3 days, Harold watched from his veranda as the elephant lingered in the same area. She moved slowly, deliberately, never venturing far from the same cluster of trees. Her feeding was inefficient and seemed to cause her pain. She couldn't rear up on her hind legs to reach higher branches, couldn't move quickly enough to access the best vegetation before other animals claimed it. On the fourth morning, she was gone, and Harold felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. The elephant's absence affected Harold more than he'd anticipated. Over the previous 3 days, watching her struggle had given him something to focus on besides his own grief. Her presence had provided a routine: morning observations from the veranda, afternoon checks to see if she'd moved, evening assessments of her condition. Without that structure, the emptiness of his days became overwhelming again. But she returned the following week, this time settling even closer to his property. Harold found himself studying her routine with increasing attention, noting how she struggled to reach resources that healthy elephants accessed with ease. Her left rear leg was clearly compromised, causing her to move with an awkward, three-legged gait that limited her mobility and efficiency. More concerning, she seemed to be losing weight, her ribs becoming more visible beneath skin that was developing the dull appearance associated with poor nutrition. Something about her solitary struggle reminded Harold of his own recent months. Like the elephant, he was isolated from his natural social group, struggling to perform basic tasks that had once been effortless, moving through his environment with pain and difficulty. The parallel wasn't lost on him: two displaced creatures trying to survive in a world that had suddenly become unwelcoming. That evening, Harold made a decision that would change both their lives. He loaded a wheelbarrow with carrots, bananas, and sweet potatoes from his garden and wheeled it to the edge of his property. Maintaining a respectful distance of about 30 meters, he arranged the food in a neat pile near the acacia grove where the elephant spent most of her time, then retreated to his house. By morning, every piece of food was gone. Harold felt a surge of satisfaction unlike anything he'd experienced since Margaret's death. For the first time in months, he'd accomplished something that mattered, helped another living being in a concrete and meaningful way. The elephant's acceptance of his offering felt like communication, acknowledgement that his gesture had been both noticed and appreciated. The pattern established itself gradually over the following days. Each evening, Harold would prepare fresh produce from his garden and the local market, wheel it to the designated spot, and retreat to observe from a distance. Each morning the food would be consumed, leaving only scattered fragments and the massive footprints that confirmed his visitor's identity. He never saw her eating, but the evidence of her nightly visits accumulated: broken branches where she'd moved through the undergrowth, compressed earth where she'd rested, the subtle signs of an elephant's passage that Harold was learning to read. On the 10th day of this routine, Harold decided to modify his approach. Instead of leaving the food and immediately retreating, he would remain outside, pretending to tend his garden while keeping the feeding station in his peripheral vision. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reminded him of the sunsets Margaret had loved, the elephant emerged from the tree line. Harold's heart hammered against his ribs as she approached the food cautiously, her massive head swiveling to scan for threats. He remained motionless, bent over his tomato plants with hands that trembled slightly from excitement and nervousness. When she finally reached the vegetables, she paused and looked directly at him. For a moment that felt like hours. Human and elephant regarded each other across the African twilight. Harold was struck by the intelligence in her eyes, the way she seemed to be assessing him as carefully as he was studying her. There was no fear in her gaze, but there was evaluation, a calculation of whether this strange arrangement posed any danger to her. Then, slowly, deliberately, she picked up a sweet potato with her trunk and consumed it while maintaining eye contact with Harold. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of his offering, and perhaps even a recognition of his intent. Harold felt tears prick his eyes as he realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, the beginning of trust between species, the foundation of a relationship that transcended normal boundaries between human and wild animal. Harold began to think of her as a Mara, a name Margaret had once suggested for the daughter they'd never had, meaning eternal in Sanskrit. The name felt fitting for a creature who seemed to exist outside normal time, moving with the ancient rhythm of her species, yet somehow connected to Harold's very human need for purpose and companionship. As weeks passed, Amara's visits became more predictable and extended. She would arrive just before sunset, approach the feeding station with increasing confidence, and remain in the grove until dawn. Sometimes Harold would hear her moving through the night, the soft rumble of her stomach, the gentle whoosh of air from her trunk, the almost musical sound of her breathing. These nocturnal sounds became a comfort to Harold, proof that he wasn't entirely alone in the vast African landscape. Harold found himself planning his days around these evening encounters. He researched elephant nutrition extensively, learning which foods would be most beneficial for an animal recovering from injury. He discovered that elephants could consume up to 300 pounds of vegetation daily, and while his modest offerings wouldn't sustain her entirely, they could provide crucial nutrients and calories that might make the difference between survival and starvation during the challenging dry season ahead. More importantly, Harold realized that Amara was beginning to trust him in ways that extended beyond simple feeding. Where once she had fled at the slightest unexpected movement, she now barely glanced up when he moved around his property during her visits. She seemed to recognize his voice when he spoke softly to her, turning her massive ears toward him like satellite dishes, seeking a signal. The invisible barrier between them was slowly dissolving, replaced by something that felt remarkably like mutual recognition and respect. One evening, as Harold arranged fresh pineapple and watermelon near the grove, Amara emerged earlier than usual. Instead of waiting for him to retreat to a safe distance, she approached while he was still nearby, moving with purpose but without alarm. Harold froze, uncertain whether to move away or stand still, acutely aware that he was in the presence of a creature that could easily kill him if she chose to do so. Amara solved the dilemma for him. She extended her trunk toward the fruit, selected a piece of pineapple with delicate precision, and then something unprecedented happened. She held out a small branch toward Harold, offering it as if in exchange for his gift. The branch was freshly broken, still green, clearly chosen with intention rather than randomly picked up. Harold's eyes filled with tears as he accepted the branch with trembling hands. In that moment, he understood that what was developing between them transcended mere feeding. It was communication, mutual recognition, perhaps even the beginning of friendship. The gift was simple, almost primitive by human standards, but its significance was profound. Amara had acknowledged Harold not just as a food source, but as a being worthy of reciprocal relationship. 3 months into their evening ritual, Harold's world had transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. The crushing loneliness that had defined his days since Margaret's death had given way to anticipation and purpose. He found himself talking to Amara during her visits, sharing stories about his late wife, his concerns about conservation, his observations about the changing landscape around them. Most remarkably, she seemed to listen. Amara would pause in her eating when Harold spoke, her large ears turning toward him with what appeared to be genuine attention. Sometimes she would respond with low rumbles, infrasonic communications that Harold felt more than heard, vibrations that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity and create an almost physical connection between them. These exchanges felt like conversation. Though Harold couldn't be certain how much of the apparent communication was real, and how much was his own desperate need to believe he wasn't talking to himself. Harold began to understand Amara's physical limitations more clearly as their relationship deepened. The old injury to her leg had healed poorly, leaving her with reduced mobility and chronic pain that affected every aspect of her behavior. She couldn't keep up with the fast-moving herds that periodically passed through the area, couldn't compete effectively for resources during dry seasons, couldn't fulfill her natural role as part of elephant society. Her isolation wasn't just physical, but social and psychological as well. But with Harold's supplemental feeding, Amara was thriving in ways that became increasingly obvious. Her coat had developed a healthier sheen, losing the dull appearance that had characterized her condition when they first met. Her movements seemed less labored, and she had even gained weight, her ribs no longer visible beneath skin that now appeared well-nourished. More remarkably, she seemed happier, if such a human emotion could be attributed to an elephant. She would sometimes play with the food Harold brought, tossing fruits into the air with her trunk or splashing water from the small basin he'd installed near the feeding station. Harold's own transformation was equally profound. The daily preparation of Amara's meals gave structure to his days, replacing the aimless drifting that had characterized his life since Margaret's death. The evening encounters provided social contact he hadn't realized he desperately needed, even if that contact was with a member of another species. Most importantly, caring for Amara connected him to something larger than his own grief, to the complex ecosystem surrounding them, to the urgent conservation challenges facing Kenya's wildlife, to the possibility that individual actions could make meaningful differences in an increasingly troubled world. The relationship evolved beyond simple feeding as Harold learned to read Amara's moods and preferences. She disliked overripe bananas, but loved them when they were still slightly green. She had a particular fondness for watermelon rinds, which she would save for last like a dessert, rolling them around in her trunk before consuming them with what seemed like genuine enjoyment. She preferred her water slightly warm and would wait patiently if Harold had just filled her basin with cold water from the well, somehow understanding that the temperature would moderate within a few minutes. Amara, in turn, seemed to understand Harold's routines and emotions with uncanny accuracy. On days when he felt particularly melancholy, usually anniversaries or holidays that reminded him of Margaret, Amara would linger longer than usual, sometimes approaching close enough that Harold could feel the warmth radiating from her massive body. During these moments, she would stand quietly nearby, not feeding or moving, simply present in a way that felt like companionship rather than mere proximity. It was during one of these closer encounters that Harold first made physical contact with Amara. She had been reaching for a mango that had rolled slightly beyond her comfortable range, stretching her trunk awkwardly due to her injured leg and clearly struggling with the movement. Without thinking, Harold stepped forward and rolled the fruit closer, bringing it within easy reach. As he stepped back, Amara's trunk brushed against his arm in what might have been accidental contact or might have been intentional acknowledgement. The touch lasted only seconds, but Harold was amazed by the texture, surprisingly soft despite its obvious power, warm and slightly damp, incredibly sensitive based on the delicate way Amara manipulated objects with it. She showed no alarm at the contact, and from that day forward, these brief touches became part of their interaction, moments of connection that felt almost sacred to Harold. Harold's neighbors and the occasional conservation officials who passed through the area were aware of the unusual relationship developing on his property. Most viewed it with bemused tolerance. The eccentric old Englishman who fed a wild elephant wasn't harming anyone, and Amara's presence actually seemed to deter crop raiding by other elephants who might otherwise have been attracted to the area. Some even suggested that Harold's arrangement was providing a valuable service by keeping a potentially problematic animal occupied and well-fed. But not everyone approved of what Harold was doing. Kenya Wildlife Service regulations strictly prohibited feeding wild animals, a policy designed to prevent dangerous human-wildlife conflicts and maintain natural animal behaviors. The reasoning was sound. Wild animals that became habituated to humans could become dangerous, lose their natural foraging skills, or develop dependencies that were ultimately harmful to both the animals and nearby human communities. Harold knew he was technically violating these guidelines, but he rationalized his actions by pointing to Amara's special circumstances. She wasn't a healthy elephant who could survive normally in the wild. She was a disabled individual who would likely die without intervention. The choice wasn't between a natural life and an artificial one. It was between life and death. Under those circumstances, Harold believed that rigid adherence to regulations was not just inappropriate, but cruel. The ethical complexity of the situation weighed heavily on Harold's mind. He respected conservation science and understood why feeding wild animals was generally prohibited. He'd seen the problems that could arise when wildlife lost their fear of humans or became dependent on artificial food sources. But faced with Amara's specific needs and their developing relationship, simple rule-following seemed inadequate. He was saving one elephant's life. Wasn't that worth some regulatory flexibility? As the dry season approached, Harold's dilemma intensified. Amara would face even greater challenges finding adequate nutrition during the coming months when natural food sources became scarce and widely scattered. Other elephants would migrate to areas with better water and grazing, following ancient routes that led to seasonal feeding grounds. But Amara's mobility limitations made such journeys difficult or impossible. Harold's feeding would become not just helpful, but essential for her survival. At the same time, Harold was dealing with his own challenges that threatened the stability of their arrangement. At 68, living alone in rural Kenya, he was increasingly aware of his vulnerability and mortality. A fall, a medical emergency, or simply the normal progression of aging could disrupt the routine on which Amara now depended. What would happen to her if something happened to him? The question haunted Harold, adding urgency to his already complex feelings about their relationship. These concerns came into sharp focus when Harold developed a persistent cough that wouldn't respond to over-the-counter remedies. Initially, he dismissed it as a minor irritation, perhaps caused by the dry season dust or a temporary respiratory infection. But when the cough progressed to shortness of breath and chest pains that woke him at night, Harold finally acknowledged that he needed medical attention. The nearest hospital with adequate diagnostic equipment was in Nairobi, a day's journey from Harold's remote location. Making the trip meant not just leaving Amara without her evening meal, but abandoning the routine that had become the organizing principle of both their lives. Harold delayed as long as possible, hoping his symptoms would improve on their own, but eventually the pain and difficulty breathing made the decision for him. The diagnosis was both reassuring and alarming. Harold had developed a mild case of pneumonia, easily treatable with antibiotics, but the underlying examination revealed signs of heart disease that would require ongoing monitoring and medication. The doctor recommended staying in Nairobi for several weeks to ensure proper recovery and to establish a treatment plan that would prevent future complications. Harold's first concern wasn't for his own health, but for Amara. For the first time in months, he would be unable to provide her evening meal, unable to maintain the routine that had become central to both their lives. He arranged for a neighbor to leave food at the station, providing detailed instructions about Amara's preferences and the proper placement of provisions. But he knew it wouldn't be the same. The bond they had developed was built on routine, proximity, and mutual recognition, elements that couldn't be simply delegated to someone else. During his 3 weeks in the city, Harold worried constantly about Amara. Had she waited for him those first few evenings? Standing by the feeding station and wondering why her routine had been disrupted? Had she eventually given up and moved on to find other resources, perhaps struggling to locate adequate nutrition without his supplemental feeding? Had she survived the disruption to their routine, or had the sudden change in her circumstances proved too stressful for an animal already compromised by injury and isolation? These questions tormented Harold during his recovery, but they also clarified something important. His relationship with Amara had become the most meaningful connection in his life. She wasn't just a wild animal he happened to feed. She had become family in the truest sense, a being whose welfare mattered to him as much as his own. The intensity of his concern surprised Harold. He hadn't realized how thoroughly their lives had become intertwined until the connection was threatened. Harold's return to Amboseli was tinged with anxiety and hope in equal measure. During the 3-week absence, his neighbor had dutifully maintained the feeding station according to Harold's detailed instructions, but reported that Amara had only appeared sporadically, often approaching the food but not consuming it entirely. She seemed confused by the change in routine, suspicious of the unfamiliar human presence, or perhaps simply waiting for something or someone that wasn't there. The drive from Nairobi gave Harold time to process his fears about what he might find. Would Amara still be in the area, or had she finally moved on in search of more reliable resources? Would she remember him after the extended absence, or had their carefully constructed trust been damaged by what might have seemed like abandonment from her perspective? Harold realized that he was more nervous about this reunion than he had been about any of his medical procedures. The first evening back, Harold resumed his routine with nervous anticipation that bordered on prayer. As sunset approached, he arranged fresh fruits and vegetables at the station with extra care, including all of Amara's favorite foods in generous quantities. He retreated to his usual observation point and waited, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. For an hour, nothing happened. The familiar sounds of the African evening began, the calls of guinea fowls settling for the night, the distant whoops of hyenas, the rustle of small creatures moving through the undergrowth. But there was no sign of the massive presence that Harold had been hoping to see. Just as he was beginning to fear the worst, that Amara had indeed moved on and he would never see her again, she emerged from the tree line. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, moving with the fluid coordination of a family unit, came 5 other elephants, 3 adults and 2 juveniles. Harold had never seen Amara with other elephants during all their months together. He had assumed she was permanently separated from any social group due to her disability. The sight of her leading a small family group toward the feeding station left Harold speechless with amazement and confusion. The group approached the feeding station cautiously, with Amara clearly in the lead, despite her mobility limitations. She moved with confidence and purpose, her body language suggesting that she was guiding the others to a familiar and safe location. Harold watched in fascination as she consumed some of the food he had provided. But then something remarkable happened. She began guiding the others to share the feast, using gentle touches with her trunk and low vocalizations that Harold could barely hear. Amara introduced her family to the bounty that Harold had been providing. She seemed to be explaining the situation, demonstrating that this food source was safe and reliable, worthy of their trust and attention. The other elephants followed her lead, initially cautious but gradually relaxing as they realized there was no threat associated with this unusual arrangement. Harold watched in amazement as the elephants shared the food peacefully, with the adults ensuring the juveniles received adequate portions before satisfying their own hunger. It was his first glimpse into the sophisticated social dynamics that governed elephant relationships, the cooperation, communication, and mutual care that defined their communities. The scene was both beautiful and educational, revealing aspects of elephant behavior that Harold had only read about in scientific literature. As the group fed, Amara kept looking toward Harold's position with what seemed like intentionality. Finally, she separated from the others and approached closer than she ever had before, stopping just a few meters away, where Harold could see her clearly in the fading light. In the gathering darkness, Harold could see something held delicately in her trunk, something she had been carrying but not consuming. Slowly, almost ceremonially, Amara placed the object on the ground between them and stepped back. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, clearly intended as an offering or gift rather than random behavior. Harold approached cautiously and discovered an extraordinary sight. A pristine white flower, unlike anything he had seen in the local flora. The petals were perfectly formed, with an almost luminescent quality in the twilight that made them seem to glow with their own inner light. Harold had lived in Kenya long enough to recognize the significance of what Amara had brought him. The flower was a rare desert rose bloom, found only in the most remote areas of the ecosystem and blooming only after significant rainfall. These flowers were notoriously difficult to find, even for experienced botanists, hidden in rocky outcroppings far from human habitation and lasting only a few days before withering in the harsh African sun.